Let's start by creating an ASP.NET Core Web API project, and I'm going to call it CRUD tutorial. And I'm going to use the default setting and hit create. Alright, let's delete the default controller and the default model of weather forecast that the Visual Studio will create for us. And the first thing that we need to do is to install some NuGet packages for Entity Framework Core. So just open up the NuGet solution inside the browse, search for Entity Framework. From the packages that show up, install Entity Framework Core, Entity Framework Design, Tools, and SQL Server. Now that we have our packages installed, we need to create our DB context. The DB context is the bridge between our application and our database. The database can be SQL Server, it can be MySQL, it could be SQLite, because we are using Entity Framework. So let's go create a folder, let's call it Data, and inside Data I want to create a new class. Let's add class, and here I will call it Application DB Context. The name doesn't matter actually, you can name it anything that you want. The thing that is important is that this class should inherit from the DB context. We're going to use the Microsoft Entity Framework Core so it can recognize the DB context. Now what we need to do in order to assign our database, so our database has a connection string, right? So we need to add that connection string to our application so we can connect to that database. Here, if I press Ctrl dot, you can see some options that appears inside my Visual Studio. Here we have generate overrides. The overrides are the existing methods that are inside our DB context. So we want to change the DB context connection string. And for doing that, we need to override one of its method that is inside DB context, which is on configuration. First of all, deselect all of them and select the on configuration, press OK. It will generate the on configuration method and override it from the DB context. Now inside my DB context, here you can see we have a DB context option builder. So for our option builder, here you can see the Visual Studio is suggesting me the code that we need to write. This is exactly what we wanted to write. Option builder.use SQL server. This method will get a connection string from us and connect to the database. And because we have installed Entity Framework SQL Server, it will recognize the use SQL server. Here you can say use SQLite if you have installed the library. For the connection string, I have prepared a connection string. Alright, here is the connection string that we're going to use. Server is going to be dot, which means that it's going to be a local server. The database, you can name it anything, MyDB, or let's call it dgdev CRUD. Okay, these are all the parameters that we need for our connection string. We need to pass these DB context some models as well. The models that we pass to our DB context are going to be the tables that are being created inside our database. So let's go create our models for our database. Let's create another folder. I will call it models. Inside models, I want to separate all of my models from the models that I'm going to set as a database table. So I'm going to create another folder for organizing my models. I will call this data models. Here I'm going to create only one table. Let's create a class and I'm going to call it products. It's going to be a simple class. It's not going to inherit from any other class. And here we just need to add some parameters. You see, the first suggestion is public int ID. The ID keyword in our data models represent a primary key in our tables. If you want to change the name of ID, which is recognized by Entity Framework, for example, my ID, this is not going to be a primary key. So if I want to set these my ID as a primary key, I should open up two brackets, and here say key. This is called data annotation, and it is possible by the package that we have installed called design. And as you can see here, the system component model and data annotation package has been added as I have added the key. So let's just remove this and set this to ID. Beside ID, I want to have a name, a description, a product ID, and a public string or a public double price. So this is going to be my product, and let's save it. Here I want to add the table to my DB context. To add it to our DB context, we need to set it as public DB set. DB set also is recognized by Entity Framework, and it is going to say to Entity Framework that this is going to be one of the tables of my models. So let's give it products, and the name that we're going to give to this DB set is going to be the name of the table that is going to be created inside the SQL server. So I'm gonna here give it the name product. Only creating the DB set and the DB context will not create the tables inside our database. What we need to do is to create some migrations. What migrations do for us is that it will turn our code into query SQLs that the SQL server can understand, and it will create the codes that we have here inside the SQL server. So to add the migration, we need to go to Package Manager Console. If you don't have Package Manager Console, go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and Package Manager Console is here. Here, all I have to do is say add migration and space, then the name of the migration that I'm going to create. So here we are, this is the first migration that we are going to create, so I'm going to name it init, which is short for initialization. Here you can see our migration has been created. It is still simply a code, but as you can see here and the code is still very readable. So here is saying migration builder, first create a table of name product, and these are the parameters, these are the type, and the primary key is ID. And in order to execute our migration that we have created into our database, we simply just need to say update database. Alright, as you can see here, our database has been updated. I've forgotten to zoom in, so I have zoomed a little bit so you can see better. Alright, now inside our controller, we need to create a new controller. Let's go inside API controller empty, and add an empty controller. Let's just call it CRUD controller. In .NET Core MVC, our controllers are inherited from controller class, but in Web API, we are inherited from controller base. The controller class has some features like returning view. Alright, now let's create our methods. The first method going to be public iActionResult get. Here it is giving us an error because we are not returning anything, so let's say return OK. Because we are dealing with databases, and a database is not something that is inside our application, so anytime that we are going to have a connection or a communication between our application and another application, we need to define our method as async, because we don't know how much time the SQL server is going to take to return a result for us. So we need to wait for that result. And we're going to do that by saying async task, and our iActionResult is going to go inside that task. Now let's copy this method, paste it a few times. One of them going to be get, one of them going to be get by ID, another one going to be create, then update, and the last one going to be delete. Now our route here is going to be API controller, and at last I want to give it action as well. So our route gonna be the name of our actions or our methods at the end of our controller. Now let's create a reference of our application DB context so we can access the DB context that we have created or our database that we have. So I'm gonna say private read-only application DB context. Let's call it context, and it's going to be equal to new application DB context. Now here inside get going to be context dot products, and this will read all the products that we have inside our application. But I'm going to say toList and toList async, which is going to get all of our products from the database, get it to our code in an async way. So when we have async here, we need to put await. So what it's going to do, it's going to say wait for our products to be turned into a list from our database, and until this is not done, you are not going to go into the next line. And the result of our product.toList async, I'm gonna store it inside a variable called result, and here inside OK, I'm gonna return the result. Alright, now let's go for get by ID. Get by ID is just the same, and I'm gonna say var result gonna be equal to wait context dot product dot, instead of toList async, I'm gonna say first or default async. So here we want to give an ID to our method. Let's just give it right now int ID, and we want to find the product with this ID. So here inside first or default async, I'm gonna say x dot ID equal to ID. So it's going to find me the product that, which is the product ID, is equal to ID that we have passed to our get by ID here, and then return the result. If I hover my mouse on the result, here you can see the type of our result is models, data models, and products. It can be null because it is first or default. If it doesn't find the product ID that we have sent, it will return a null value for us. Alright, now it's turn to create. Let's create a model here. Let's first create a folder named product, and all of the models for our products, I'm gonna put it inside this folder. Let's create a class and call it product create request. Inside the create request, I want all of the methods, I want all of the properties of our product beside ID. We do not need to get the ID because it is primary key and it is going to be created automatically. So here are all of the other parameters, and inside create, let's say we want to get a product create request, and it is going to be named request. Now here we do not to get anything from database, we're going to create something inside the database. And to create something, I'm going to just say context dot product dot add. Here you can see our add method is going to get a product entity. So first we need to turn our product create request into a product model. Let's create a product model. Let's put it equal to a new product, and here I'm going to give it some values. We do not have the ID, but the description going to be equal to request.description that we have passed. The name is going to be equal to request.name, the price, and the product ID. And here I'm just going to simply pass the product. And the code that we have here will create the query of creating this product inside our database. But for it to execute this query inside the database, we need to say await context.savechanges async, and it will simply create the product inside our database. Now let's go for delete. That is simpler. It's just gonna need an ID, and just like before, we need to get the product with the same ID. Here I'm gonna set a validation. Let's change the name to product because we do not need to return a result. I'm gonna say if product is equal to null, throw a new exception for me and tell me that product does not exist. And if it wasn't null and it have passed our if statement, what I want to do is to remove the product and then save changes to the database. That's for our delete. We need this code for our update, and here for our update we need another model. Let's just create one here. I'm gonna call it product update request, and as create we need all the parameters of our product, but here because it is already exists inside our database, I want to get the ID as well. Now let's go inside our controller, and here I'm going to say product update request. Let's call it request, and I'm going to say the product that we have get from the database dot description going to be equal to request.description product.name product.price, and product.product ID going to be equals to anything that we have sent from the request that we have sent. And also this ID is going to be the request.id that have been passed from our request. Now let's save it. Here if I run my project, let's use HTTP. Here you can see it's giving me an error because it cannot recognize the request type of our methods. So we need to define some request type because we are using REST API. So let's assign the HTTP GET for our GET method. This is a GET method as well. So we're gonna give it HTTP GET. The create going to be post method, update gonna be put, and delete gonna be delete. Now if I run, alright, here you can see our CRUD controller, and you can see each of our methods. Here we have get. If I try it out and execute, you can see we have nothing because we have nothing inside the database yet. Let's add a product. The name, let's just give it monitor. Description gonna be test. Product ID gonna be 1005. Price gonna be $20, and let's execute. Okay, here you can see 200, which means that our request has been successful. Let's create another one. Let's call it mouse. Test is okay, and this is gonna be 1002. It's gonna be $10, and execute. Okay, now we should have options. Here you can see we have two products inside our database. All right, let's test our update. I'm gonna say the item with the ID of 1. Let's change the name to a string and description to a string and anything that is here. Alright, now if I get them again, it's not gonna work. Why is that? Let's go see. Alright, it's because we haven't saved it inside our database. So we're gonna say await context.save changes, and before we save it we need to update the database as well. So I'm gonna say context.product.update the product. Alright, let's run it again. Go inside update and the product ID of 1. Let's execute. Okay, and inside get, here you can see the data has been changed. And in get by ID, if I give it the ID of 1, it's gonna get only the product with the ID that I have given it. Now let's delete one. Here if I say delete the item 1, it's going to be deleted, and if I get it, you can see the ID 2 is the only item available inside our database. So this was the simplest CRUD application possible inside the .NET Core with Entity Framework and I'm going to create a follow-up tutorial for our CRUD application that we have created here, because we can do so much in here. We're going to separate the codes that we have here from controller to a service, and we're going to learn about repository pattern. We're going to add another data model and learn about relationships between our models. So make sure to like this video to give me the energy to create more videos like this, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out the future videos that I'm going to post. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.